When my sister moved back home, everything fell apart. I suppose I should have seen it coming, the way a storm gathers at the horizon, thick and inevitable. My sister, Julia, and her husband, Greg, moving in with our parents felt like something out of a script I had read before, a slow-building catastrophe wrapped in the pretense of necessity. It started with the phone call, the kind that sends an eerie chill down your spine before you even answer. Julia's voice was a mix of exhaustion and barely restrained desperation, laced with just enough forced optimism to make it clear she was trying to sell an idea she hadn't fully convinced herself of yet. Mom and Dad, of course, didn't hesitate. That was always their way. Family first, no questions asked, even when the answers were screaming to be acknowledged. They had the space, they had the means, and they had that ingrained sense of duty that came from a generation that believed in shouldering burdens without complaint. I knew the minute Julia asked that they would say yes, and I knew just as well that this decision would unravel things that had been loosely held together for years. The house itself, a sprawling two-story colonial in the suburbs of New Jersey, had always felt too big for just Mom and Dad. It had been the centerpiece of our childhood, a place that once brimmed with laughter and the boundless energy of youth. But time had dulled its shine, leaving behind only echoes of what had been. When I visited, I could feel the ghosts of our younger selves lingering in the walls, watching as we drifted further from what we used to be. The thought of Julia and Greg moving in stirred something in me, something uncomfortable and restless. It wasn't just that it disrupted the balance. It was that it threatened to dredge up things we had all tried to bury. Julia and Greg's situation was bleak. There was no denying that. Greg had lost his job nearly a year ago, another casualty of corporate downsizing, and despite his efforts, nothing had materialized. Their savings had dwindled, their credit cards maxed out, and the weight of it all had begun to crack their marriage like ice under pressure. They had held on for as long as they could in their cramped apartment in Philadelphia, but when eviction loomed, pride had to be set aside. And so, they packed up what little they could fit into a U-Haul and made the trek back to the house we had grown up in, seeking refuge from the storm they could no longer outrun. At first, it was all pleasantries, the kind that skimmed the surface and ignored the jagged edges beneath. Mom made a grand show of welcoming them, filling the house with the comforting smells of home-cooked meals, as if she could nourish away the tension. Dad, ever the quiet anchor, moved silently in the background, making space without complaint. But I knew better. I could see it in the way his hands lingered on the armrests of his recliner, fingers twitching in the way they always did when he was bracing for something. It was only a matter of time before the weight of the arrangement made itself fully known. Greg, for all his faults, tried to act as if everything was normal. He put on the same bravado he always had, flashing easy smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. But there was something different about him now, something worn and defeated. He had always been the kind of man who prided himself on control, on being the provider, and I could see that this new reality had stripped him of that. It made him restless, pacing the house as if searching for a purpose he no longer had. Julia, on the other hand, threw herself into the role of dutiful daughter, helping Mom in the kitchen, organizing cabinets that didn't need organizing, and fussing over details that had never mattered before. It was her way of keeping the walls from closing in, of convincing herself that this was temporary, that they weren't sinking but merely pausing before swimming back to the surface. But I could see the cracks in her, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, the way she stared out the window as if searching for an escape she couldn't yet take. And then there was me, the reluctant witness to it all. I had long since escaped the confines of that house, forging a life of my own in New York, far enough away to keep my distance but close enough to be pulled back when duty called. I visited as often as was expected, keeping up the appearance of a son who hadn't completely detached. But the truth was, I had spent years trying to unspool myself from the web of family entanglements, distancing myself from the suffocating weight of unspoken tensions. And now, with Julia and Greg's arrival, it was all unraveling again, drawing me back into a dynamic I had tried so hard to leave behind. The house, once a sanctuary, was becoming something else entirely. The air was thick with unspoken resentments, with the silent calculus of who owed what to whom. I watched as my parents, well-intentioned as they were, tiptoed around the situation, offering help but avoiding the hard conversations that needed to be had. And I watched as Julia and Greg, drowning in their own turmoil, tried to pretend that they weren't sinking, that they weren't bringing the weight of their failures into a house that had already carried more than its share of burdens. I told myself I wouldn't get involved. I told myself it wasn't my place. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Family had a way of pulling you back in no matter how far you ran. And this was only the beginning. I should have known the balance wouldn't last. The tension, once lurking beneath the surface like a crack in the foundation, finally began to show. It started with small things, the kind of grievances that seem trivial in isolation but pile up like dead leaves, suffocating everything beneath them. Greg, with his forced nonchalance, had begun to wear on Dad's nerves. He spent his days in the house, wandering aimlessly, taking up space in a way that made it clear he no longer knew his place in the world. Job applications sat half-finished on the dining table, excuses piling up as quickly as the unopened bills that arrived in neat stacks by the front door. Dad, never one to voice his frustrations outright, found other ways to express them. The way he exhaled sharply whenever Greg walked into the room. The way he suddenly found urgent tasks that needed completing outside, as if the walls were closing in on him. Mom, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over, cooking more, cleaning more, filling the house with the scent of fresh bread and lavender candles as if that could mask the growing discord. But I saw through it. We all did. Julia was unraveling. She held it together in front of Mom, smiling too much, moving too quickly, talking about the job interviews Greg supposedly had lined up. But in the quiet moments, I saw the truth. She wasn't sleeping. The dark circles beneath her eyes deepened, her once meticulous appearance giving way to unkempt hair and clothes that no longer seemed to fit quite right. She was disappearing into herself, and I recognized it because I had seen it before. First in the years of our childhood, when she bore the brunt of our parents' expectations, and now again as she shouldered the weight of a man who had become an anchor dragging her down. It was the money that broke everything open. Greg had promised to contribute. That was the arrangement. Even if it wasn't much, even if it was just enough to cover groceries or utilities, it was supposed to be something. But the weeks passed, and nothing came. Mom and Dad wouldn't say anything, not directly, but the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the worried glances exchanged over dinner, said everything. Greg, either oblivious or willfully ignorant, continued his routine as if nothing had changed, sipping coffee in the mornings as if he wasn't drinking from a cup my parents had paid for. Then came the discovery of the missing jewelry. Mom had a small collection, nothing extravagant, just sentimental pieces she had gathered over the years. A gold bracelet Dad had given her on their anniversary, a locket that had belonged to her mother. When she noticed them missing, she didn't say anything at first. Maybe she thought she had misplaced them. Maybe she was afraid of what it would mean if she acknowledged the possibility that someone had taken them. But then the pawn shop receipt surfaced, tucked between the couch cushions, crumpled like an afterthought. Greg's name was on it. I remember the way Dad looked at me when Mom showed him the slip of paper, the exhaustion in his face, the sheer weight of it. He didn't have to say anything for me to know what he was thinking. This house, this refuge he had built for his family, had become a place where trust was no longer sacred. And that was unforgivable. Julia, when she found out, didn't react the way I expected. There were no tears, no outbursts, just silence. A long, deafening silence that stretched through the house like a storm waiting to break. She disappeared upstairs for hours, emerging only to confirm what we all knew. Greg had done it. He had stolen from the very people who had taken him in, who had given him shelter when he had nowhere else to go. And he had done it without remorse. What happened next was inevitable. Greg was confronted, though the details of that confrontation remain unspoken. The next morning he was gone. Julia stayed, but she was a shell of herself, moving through the house like a ghost. She refused to talk about it, refused to explain what had happened in those final moments before he left. Maybe she didn't have the words. Maybe she just didn't want to say them out loud. I should have felt relief. Greg was gone. The source of so much tension had been removed. But as I sat at the kitchen table, watching Mom sip her coffee with trembling hands, watching Dad stare out the window with a look I couldn't quite place, I realized the damage had already been done. This house would never be the same. None of us would. I thought that once Greg was gone, things would start to heal, that maybe the house would settle, that the air would become lighter, that Julia would somehow find her way back to herself. But I had underestimated just how deep the wounds had gone. The problem with damage like this is that it doesn't just disappear. It festers, it spreads, it lingers in the places no one wants to look. Julia stayed, but not in the way any of us expected. She didn't try to rebuild. She didn't look for a job. She barely even left her room. Days turned into weeks, and it was as if she had become part of the house itself. Silent, unmoving, a ghost of someone we used to know. Mom tiptoed around her, bringing her food she barely touched, folding her laundry even though Julia never asked. Dad, ever the pragmatist, said nothing. But I could see the way he looked at her door, the way his lips pressed into a tight, thin line every time he passed it. And then, just when it seemed like we had all become resigned to this strange, painful limbo, something changed. Julia started leaving the house at odd hours, coming back after dark, slipping in through the side door like she didn't want to be seen. At first, I thought maybe she had found a job. Maybe she was clawing her way back. But the truth was far more unsettling. She wasn't working. She wasn't rebuilding. She was unraveling in an entirely different way. It started small. Money disappearing from Mom's purse. Dad's expensive whiskey drained faster than he could remember drinking it. And then there were the men. Strangers, never the same one twice. They would show up in cars that idled too long outside the house, headlights casting eerie shadows against the living room curtains. I never saw them stay for long, never saw more than the brief exchange of hands, the way Julia would disappear into the night with them only to return hours later, hollow-eyed and distant. Mom refused to see it. She played it off as Julia finally moving on, finally trying to get back to normal. But I knew better. I knew the signs. Whatever had broken inside of her when Greg left had stayed broken. And now, she was spiraling into something none of us could control. Dad, ever the silent force, had finally had enough. One night, I heard him yelling. Not words, just raw, furious sound. When I came downstairs, Julia was standing in the kitchen, face streaked with mascara and something else, something darker. There was blood on her hand, a split lip she hadn't bothered to wipe. She looked at me like she had no idea who I was, like I was just another stranger in a house she no longer recognized. And then she was gone. She didn't pack. She didn't leave a note. She simply disappeared into the night, and just like that, the house felt empty in a way it never had before. For a while, we waited. Mom left the porch light on every night. Dad sat by the phone in silence, as if willing it to ring. But Julia never came back. Weeks passed, then months. The seasons changed, and still, she was nothing more than a whisper in the past. And then one morning a call finally came. But it wasn't Julia. It was a detective, a name I didn't recognize, a voice heavy with something I didn't want to hear. They had found her, miles away in a rundown motel off the interstate, a place where people went to disappear. There was no struggle, no fight, no final moment of clarity. Just silence, just stillness, just the cold, hard fact that she was gone. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone long after the call had ended. Mom sobbed in the other room. Dad said nothing. There was nothing left to say. We had all lost her long before she was ever truly gone. And yet, the weight of it settled in my chest like a stone, immovable and suffocating. The house feels different now, quieter, lonelier. Mom still sets a place for Julia at dinner, even though no one has the heart to tell her to stop. Dad spends more time outside, as if the open air can somehow cleanse him of what's been lost. And me? I sit here in the same chair in the same house wondering how we got here, wondering if there was something I could have done, wondering if there was ever a point where any of this could have been stopped. And if I had seen it, if I had known where it was all leading, would I have done anything differently?